Did you know that for centuries, humans never actually slept through the night? What did our ancestors do in those lost hours of the deep midnight? And why did we suddenly stop this ancient rhythm? Before we travel back to the 17th century, I want you to know that what you are hearing is a real human voice, not AI. In a world of synthetic sounds, I believe authentic history deserves an authentic human connection. As you settle in, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from tonight and what time is it there? Let us know in the comments. If these stories help you find peace, please consider liking this video and subscribing to join our community of night watchers. Now, take a deep breath and let's step into the quiet world of the two sleeps. The transition from the late evening hours into the first segment of rest during the 17th century was a deeply ingrained biological and social ritual that defined the pre-industrial human experience. In the absence of powerful artificial illumination, the rhythms of the day were strictly dictated by the setting of the sun and the gradual descent of natural darkness over the landscape. As the golden hues of the hearth fire began to fade into a dull red glow, families across the Western world prepared themselves for what was universally known as the first sleep or the dead of sleep. This initial period of rest usually commenced shortly after dusk, lasting until approximately midnight, and was characterized by a profound and restorative heaviness that allowed the body to recover from the physical rigors of manual labor and domestic toil. The architectural environment of the era, with its thick timber frames and lime-washed walls, served as a silent witness to this nightly transition into a state of semi-consciousness. Within these dimly lit chambers, the air often carried the scent of drying herbs, tallow candles, and the lingering smoke of the chimney, creating a sensory backdrop that signaled the arrival of the first rest. Unlike the modern expectation of a single, uninterrupted 8-hour block of slumber, the 17th century mind viewed sleep as a flexible and segmented process. This first sleep was not merely a lapse in activity, but a distinct phase of existence, often described in contemporary journals and medical texts as the most vital part of the nocturnal cycle for physical healing. As individuals lay upon mattresses stuffed with straw, horsehair, or more luxurious feathers, they surrendered to a slumber that was deep yet inherently temporary. The stillness of the house during these hours was absolute, broken only by the settling of the structural beams or the distant sound of livestock in the barn. This was a time when the world seemed to withdraw into itself, leaving the sleeper in a state of primal security within the boundaries of their home. The concept of insomnia as we understand it today was largely absent, because the expectation of staying asleep for the entire night did not yet exist as a social or medical norm. Instead, the first sleep was the anchor of the night, a predictable and reliable descent into a quietude that would eventually give way to the midnight awakening. This transition was facilitated by the lack of evening distractions, as the high cost of candles and the physical exhaustion of the day made an early retirement both practical and necessary. The heavy linen sheets and thick wool blankets provided a cocoon-like environment, sheltering the occupant from the damp chill of the unheated rooms. In this state, the mind began its first journey through the layers of the subconscious, processing the events of the day in a slow, rhythmic fashion that mirrored the pulse of the natural world. This collective entry into rest created a unique social atmosphere, where the entire community was synchronized with the celestial clock. The first sleep was a period of intense cellular repair and growth, a biological necessity that prepared the individual for the active and conscious interval that would follow in the middle of the night. It was a time of total surrender to the darkness, a surrender that was respected by the household and the law alike, with legal documents often referencing the time after first sleep as a specific chronological marker. This structured approach to the night reflected a broader understanding of human nature as being fundamentally connected to the environment. The silence of this period was not a void but a presence, a heavy and comforting blanket that allowed for the slow dissolution of the day's anxieties. As the hour reached its peak, the first sleep would naturally begin to lift, transitioning the sleeper toward a state of quiet wakefulness that was as natural as the rest that preceded it. This cycle was the heartbeat of the 17th century, a testament to a time when humanity lived in harmony with the shifting shadows and the ancient requirement for a divided rest. The physical sanctuary of the 17th century bedroom was a space defined by heavy textures and the pervasive presence of natural materials that served as a defense against the encroaching cold and the vast, silent darkness of the rural landscape. At the heart of this environment stood the bedstead, a massive, four-poster structure crafted from seasoned oak or walnut that had been darkened by decades of smoke and beeswax polish. This piece of furniture was often the most valuable possession within the household, a symbol of stability and lineage that was frequently passed down through generations in detailed wills. The bed was enclosed by heavy wool or linen hangings, known as bed curtains, which were drawn tightly at night to create a microclimate of warmth and to shield the occupants from the perceived dangers of the night air. These curtains, often dyed in deep, earthy tones, muted the sounds of the house and provided the sense of absolute privacy in a time when many living spaces were shared with servants or extended family. Within this enclosed space, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of dried lavender, hops, or the faint, metallic tang of the rush matting that covered the cold stone or white-planked wooden floors. The floor itself was a patchwork of textures, often strewn with fresh herbs to mask the dampness of the earth and to provide a soft, rustling sound as one moved through the room in the dim light. Small, leaded glass windows, with their uneven panes and thick, iron latches, offered only a fragmented view of the moonlit world outside, allowing only the faintest sliver of cool, blue light to penetrate the interior. This light would catch the intricate, hand-carved details on the headboard, revealing mythological figures, floral motifs, or geometric patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering shadows. Beside the bed, a heavy wooden chest served as both a seat and a storage unit for the family's most precious linens and clothing, its iron hinges creaking softly whenever it was opened in the silence. The walls, often finished with a rough, lime-based plaster, absorbed the silence of the night, reflecting the dim glow of the dying hearth in the adjacent room. There were no mirrors to catch the light, as they were rare and expensive luxuries, and the lack of reflective surfaces contributed to the deep, immersive quality of the darkness. Every object in the room, from the simple washstand with its pewter basin to the heavy, high-backed chairs, was built for durability and function, possessing a weighted presence that anchored the room in a sense of timelessness. The bedding consisted of layers upon layers of protection, starting with a heavy canvas base known as a sacker, which supported a thick mattress filled with dried straw, corn husks, or soft goose feathers. Over these were laid sheets of coarse, unbleached linen that felt cool and crisp against the skin, followed by several thick wool blankets and a final, decorative coverlet that had been stitched together over many winter evenings. The weight of these layers provided a physical sensation of being grounded, a necessary comfort in a world where the night was often seen as an unpredictable wilderness. This environment was specifically engineered for the biphasic rhythm, providing a secure and comforting harbor for the first sleep, and a quiet, contemplative space for the midnight awakening that would inevitably follow. It was a room that respected the boundaries of the night, a place where the boundaries between the physical world and the realm of dreams were blurred by the heavy shadows and the pervasive sense of ancient peace. The 17th century bedroom was a testament to the human need for a protected, quiet space in which to navigate the long, dark hours of the night, where every texture and every scent was designed to facilitate a deep and restorative connection with the natural cycle of rest. As the first sleep deepened, the room became a vessel for the subconscious, a quiet theater where the past and the present merged in the stillness of the midnight hour. The ritualistic descent into the first sleep of the evening was a process defined by the slow and deliberate transition from the communal activities of the hearth to the solitary stillness of the bedchamber. As the late 17th century sun dipped below the horizon, the natural world began to dictate a cessation of labor that no modern clock could enforce with such absolute authority. The final chores of the day were conducted in a growing twilight, where the boundaries of objects became blurred and the familiar contours of the farmhouse softened into gray silhouettes. This was the hour when the domestic fire, having cooked the evening pottage, was carefully banked with ash to preserve the embers for the following morning, creating a faint, dying glow that cast long, flickering shadows across the kitchen flagstones. The preparation for rest began with the securing of the household, a rhythmic sequence of barring heavy oak doors and closing the thick internal shutters to keep out the damp night air and the perceived spirits of the darkness. Following this, a single rushlight or a modest tallow candle would be lit, its small, struggling flame providing just enough illumination to navigate the narrow, creaking staircases that led to the upper sleeping quarters. The air in these passages was often stagnant and cool, carrying the scent of seasoned timber and the faint, metallic tang of the iron hardware. Upon entering the bedroom, moved with a quiet efficiency born of lifelong habit, as the lack of light discouraged any unnecessary motion. The process of undressing was a slow shedding of the day's burdens, starting with the removal of heavy wool waistcoats, thick breeches, and coarse stockings that had been dampened by the fields or the damp lanes. These garments were folded carefully and placed upon a wooden chest, their weight and texture a physical reminder of the labor that had preceded this moment. Wearing only a simple, long linen night shift, the sleeper would then approach the bed, which had been prepared earlier in the day with a methodical fluffing of the straw or feather mattress. The sound of the straw shifting beneath the linen ticking was a dry, rustling whisper that signaled the imminent arrival of rest. Before climbing into the high bed, many would perform a silent, internal reflection, a mental accounting of the day's events that served as a psychological bridge between the active world and the realm of dreams. The act of entering the bed was a physical surrender, as the body sank into the deep, accommodating layers of the mattress and the heavy, cool sheets began to absorb the warmth of the skin. The initial chill of the bedding was quickly replaced by a burgeoning heat, trapped by the weight of several thick wool blankets and a decorative coverlet. This warmth acted as a powerful sedative, drawing the mind away from the lingering anxieties of the harvest or the household accounts. In the absolute silence of the room, the only audible sounds were the rhythmic breathing of the sleeper and the occasional, distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of a mouse in the thatch. This environment was free from the intrusive glare of artificial light, allowing the pineal gland to function in perfect harmony with the celestial cycles. The transition into the first sleep was not a sudden event, but a gradual dissolution of the ego, a slow drifting into a state of restorative unconsciousness that was respected by all members of the household. There was no pressure to achieve a specific duration of rest, only a requirement to submit to the natural urge for slumber that arrived with the deepening shadows. As the candle was extinguished, the room was plunged into a deep, immersive darkness that felt like a protective embrace, allowing the subconscious to begin its nightly work of repair and integration. This routine was the cornerstone of 17th century health, a deeply rooted habit that ensured the body was prepared for the physical demands of the coming day, while leaving space for the spiritual and mental exploration that would occur during the midnight watch. The first sleep was a journey into the heart of the night, a quiet voyage undertaken with a sense of profound security and ancient trust in the rhythms of the earth. Every element of this routine, from the banking of the fire to the rustle of the straw, was a note in a nightly symphony of rest that had remained unchanged for generations. The transition from the deep restorative depths of the first sleep into the quiet clarity of the midnight watch was a natural and expected phenomenon that defined the temporal architecture of the 17th century. As the initial phase of rest concluded near the arrival of the middle of the night, the human body would emerge into a state of wakefulness that was fundamentally different from the grogginess experienced in the modern era during a sleep interruption. This interval, which typically lasted between 1 and 2 hours, was characterized by a profound sense of tranquility and an almost meditative alertness that allowed for a unique form of conscious existence within the heart of the darkness. The 17th century mind did not perceive this awakening as a malfunction of the body or a source of anxiety, but rather as a sacred and functional space for reflection, prayer, and the quietude of the soul. In the absence of the intrusive glare of artificial light, the brain's chemistry followed a distinct hormonal path where elevated levels of prolactin induced a feeling of peace and creative focus that is rarely captured in the hurried pace of contemporary life. The environment during these hours was one of absolute stillness, where the only illumination came from the faint, silvery glow of the moon filtering through leaded glass or the rhythmic, dying embers of the hearth fire in the adjacent room. Within the bedchamber, the air was often cool and still, carrying the subtle scent of seasoned oak, drying lavender, and the faint, metallic tang of the night mist that lingered just beyond the shutters. Individuals would often remain within the warmth of their bedding, wrapped in thick wool blankets and supported by straw-filled mattresses, using the time to contemplate the events of the previous day or to plan for the labors of the next. For the more studious, this was the hour of the midnight scholar, a time when the mind was sharpest and the world was quietest, allowing for the reading of leather-bound texts or the recording of personal thoughts in journals by the flickering light of a single, struggling rushlight. The sound of the quill scratching across the parchment was the only internal rhythm, occasionally punctuated by the distant hoot of an owl or the rhythmic creaking of the house's structural beams as they settled in the cold. This period was also an essential time for spiritual devotion, as the silence of the night was considered the most auspicious moment for private prayer and communication with the divine. Free from the clamor and distractions of the material world, the social dimension of the watch was equally significant, as it offered a rare moment of undisturbed intimacy for couples and families who might engage in hushed, low-toned conversations that reinforced domestic bonds. In some rural communities, the watch was even a time for brief, quiet visits between neighbors who would navigate the dark and familiar lanes with an intimate knowledge of the terrain. This era of segmented rest allowed for a level of mental processing and emotional integration that provided a buffer against the physical hardships of the pre-industrial world. The 17th century individual understood that the night was not merely a void to be filled with unconsciousness, but a complex landscape with its own distinct phases and requirements. As the watch progressed, the initial surge of alertness would gradually give way to a burgeoning heaviness in the limbs and the slow, rhythmic slowing of the breath, signaling the body's readiness for the second sleep. This transition back into rest was as natural as the awakening that had preceded it, a gentle surrender to the final phase of the nocturnal cycle that would carry the sleeper until the arrival of the first light of dawn. The midnight watch was a testament to a time when humanity lived in perfect harmony with the biological and celestial clocks, respecting the ancient requirement for a divided rest that nurtured both the body and the intellect. This historical pattern of wakefulness serves as a reminder of a lost rhythm, a period where the stillness of the night was a companion rather than a challenge, providing a sanctuary for the human spirit to breathe and reflect in the restorative embrace of the deep, silent midnight. Every element of the watch, from the cool touch of the linen to the distant call of the night watchman, was part of a universal human experience that anchored the 17th century person in the steady, unhurried pulse of the natural world. The specific quality of the stillness that descended upon a 17th century household during the interval between the first and second sleep was a phenomenon rarely experienced in the modern era. This period, often referred to as the watch or the sacred silence of the deep midnight, was characterized not by a void, but by a heavy and palpable presence that reshaped the human perception of time and space. In a world entirely dependent on the sun for illumination, the arrival of true darkness signaled a profound cessation of the daytime's clamor, allowing the senses to shift their focus from the visual to the auditory and the contemplative. Within the thick stone or timber walls of the farmhouse or town dwelling, the air during these hours was often cool and utterly motionless, carrying only the subtle scents of seasoning oak. Drying herbs hung from the rafters, and perhaps the lingering, earthy aroma of the banked art fire. The absence of industrial noise, traffic, and the persistent hum of electricity created a sonic landscape of such purity that the smallest internal sound was amplified into a significant event. One might become acutely aware of the slow, rhythmic slowing of their own breath, the soft rustle of the linen night shift against the skin, or the distant tack-tack-tack of the woodworm within the antique furniture. This silence was viewed by contemporary theologians and philosophers not merely as the absence of noise, but as the natural state of the soul in communion with the divine, free from the temporal distractions of the day. It provided a sanctuary for mental processing, allowing the events and anxieties of the preceding day to be filtered through a lens of calm and detachment that is difficult to replicate in a continuous 8-hour sleep cycle. The high levels of prolactin circulating in the blood during this wakeful period contributed to this pervasive feeling of tranquility and emotional integration, creating a biological resonance with the external environmental stillness. The boundaries of the self seemed to expand into the comforting embrace of the darkness, which was perceived as a protective cloak rather than a menacing wilderness. Outside the shuttered windows, the landscape lay bathed in the cool blue light of the moon, or enveloped in the dense, impenetrable darkness of a new moon night. The external world was just as quiet, populated only by the silent growth of the forest, the slow drift of the night mist across the fields, and perhaps the slow circular flight of a hunting owl, occasionally punctuated by the rhythmic muddy splash of a night watchman making his rounds along the familiar lanes. This collective entry into silence by the entire community created a unique social bond, a shared understanding that the midnight hour was a time for private reflection and spiritual inventory. The physical structure of the bed itself, with its heavy curtains drawn tightly, created a micro-universe of absolute privacy and quietude within the already silent room. As the watch progressed, this profound external stillness began to facilitate an internal settling, a slow and graceful winding down of the conscious mind in preparation for the second sleep. The sacred silence of the watch was not an empty void, but a restorative sanctuary, a lost continent of time where the human spirit could rest and integrate itself within the slow, unhurried pulse of the natural world. This deliberate engagement with the deep midnight provided a necessary balance to the physical hardships of 17th century life, nurturing a level of resilience and mental fortitude that was anchored in the steady, predictable rhythm of the divided night. Every aspect of this period, from the cool touch of the linen sheets to the faint blue mist hanging in the cold air, was a component of a universal human experience that respected the ancient requirement for a silent and restorative interval within the heart of the darkness. The transition from the first sleep into the contemplative hours of the midnight watch in the 17th century was physically and socially centered around the domestic hearth, which functioned as the primary source of both thermal comfort and communal identity during the deepest segments of the night. This architectural feature was often a massive, stone-lined opening that occupied a significant portion of the main living space. serving as the symbolic heart of the household where the rhythms of the pre-industrial world were most clearly defined. During the interval of wakefulness between the two segments of rest, the fire was not merely a utility, but a biological anchor that facilitated the mental and spiritual processing of the individual. The historical practice of banking the fire, known as covering or couvre-feu, involved layering ash over the glowing embers to ensure the preservation of heat until the arrival of the morning light. This process created a specific visual environment of dim, cool light and deep, shifting shadows that defined the aesthetic of the nocturnal awakening. In these quiet hours, individuals would often gather in the radiant warmth of the hearth to engage in the slow integration of daily information or the quiet contemplation of leather-bound texts. The fireplace provided a necessary sanctuary from the damp chill of the unheated sleeping quarters, drawing members of the household into a shared physical proximity that reinforced social stability and domestic continuity. Historical records from the period indicate that these midnight hours were frequently spent in the oral transmission of family legacies, local folklore, and traditional histories which were narrated in low, measured tones that did not disturb the pervasive silence of the surrounding community. The radiant heat from the hearth facilitated a state of physical relaxation that supported the transition back into the second sleep, acting as a physiological trigger for the body's subsequent cooling phase. The materials used in these fireplaces, ranging from local granite and limestone to handmade clay bricks, possessed a significant thermal mass that continued to radiate warmth long after the primary fuel had been consumed. The fuel itself, typically seasoned oak, beech, or peat, burned with a predictable and steady rate, providing a reliable source of dim illumination for the midnight scholar or the domestic worker engaged in light chores. This period of the night was also an essential time for the maintenance of the hearth, as the quiet watch allowed for the careful arrangement of the embers to maximize heat distribution throughout the dwelling. The fireplace was also a site of spiritual significance, often viewed as the point of connection between the physical world and the presence of the ancestors during the stillness of the midnight watch. Contemporary journals suggest that the visual focus on the glowing coals provided a meditative anchor for the conscious mind, facilitating a level of introspection and cognitive integration that is rarely achieved in the modern era's continuous sleep cycles. The construction of these hearths, often including large timber mantles and iron fire dogs, reflected the social standing and economic resources of the household. While the wealthy might enjoy elaborate, carved stone surrounds, the rural laborer's hearth was a functional and humble space of soot and stone. Yet both served the same fundamental purpose of providing a secure haven within the deep darkness. The atmospheric quality of the fireplace during the watch was one of absolute tranquility, where the boundary between the physical world and the realm of memory became blurred by the soft lights and the steady radiation of warmth. This historical engagement with the hearth during the divided nights was a cornerstone of pre-industrial resilience, providing a sense of continuity and protection in a world defined by the absolute power of the natural elements. As the hour of the second sleep approached, the individuals would retreat from the hearth, carrying the lingering warmth of the fire back to their bedding, ensuring a seamless transition into the final phase of their nocturnal rest. The fireplace thus functioned as a chronological and sensory bridge, connecting the first sleep to the second and the darkness of the night to the inevitable arrival of the dawn. Its presence in the 17th century experience was a testament to the human ability to curate an environment of peace and stability within the heart of the deepest silence. The steady pulse of the hearth, mirrored by the slow rhythmic breathing of the household, created a universal sense of belonging within the natural order. This ancient connection to the fire remains a foundational element of the human memory of the night, representing a time when the darkness was not something to be avoided, but a space to be inhabited with dignity and grace. The figure of the midnight scholar was a common element of early modern life, especially among the pious, the academic, or those engaged in commerce requiring meticulous record-keeping. This individual utilized the quiet interval between the two segments of rest, typically occurring around midnight, as a sanctuary for intense cognitive focus, free from the clamor and immediate demands of the daytime hours. The environment of the 17th century study during these hours was optimized for introspection, characterized by deep shadows, cool air, and the pervasive sense of seasoned timber, tallow candles, and perhaps iron gall ink drying on coarse parchment. Illumination was scarce and localized, provided by a single rushlight or a modest beeswax candle that cast a warm, flickering glow upon leather-bound volumes and manuscript pages. The midnight scholar engaged in a slow, methodical digestion of information, reading theology, classical philosophy, mathematics, or nautical charts in a low measured whisper that did not disturb the profound silence of the surrounding household. This period of wakefulness was biochemically conducive to deep concentration, aided by elevated levels of the hormone prolactin, which induced a calm, persistent alertness. Complex theological arguments or intricate mathematical proofs seemed to resolve themselves more readily in the absence of external sensory inputs. The tools of the trade were simple, yet required steady hands: quills harvested from goose feathers, sharpened with small penknives, and inkwells filled with corrosive but durable liquids. The physical act of writing or translating during the watch was an anchor for the mind, providing a tangible rhythm against the slow, silent advance of the night. Diaries from the period frequently document these hours as the most productive for spiritual inventory and self-examination, allowing individuals to integrate their daily experiences with their religious or philosophical beliefs. This was not an isolated phenomenon limited to university towns. Farmers in rural districts might use the time to read the Bible by hearth light, and merchants in bustling trading centers balanced ledgers and calculated risks for the coming dawn. The Midnight Scholar symbolized a unique early modern intersection of sleep architecture and the pursuit of knowledge, where the natural segmentation of rest provided the cognitive infrastructure for intellectual development. As the hour of the second sleep approached, signaled by the physical cooling of the body and the creeping heavy-liddedness, the scholar would carefully secure their papers, extinguishing the final rushlight and returning to the heavy linen sheets of their bedding, carrying the insights gained during the watch into the final, restorative phase of the nocturnal cycle. This deliberate use of the split night nurtured a form of resilience and deep thinking, anchored in the steady, unhurried pulse of the pre-industrial world, where the darkness was not a void to be feared, but a quiet sanctuary for the human intellect to breathe and grow. The 17th century landscape was a world of profound and absolute nocturnal depth, a realm where the presence of the moon served as the primary architect of the visual and spiritual experience during the hours of divided rest. In an era before the intrusive and persistent glow of artificial illumination, the night was not a void of darkness but a sophisticated palette of indigo, deep charcoal, and shimmering silver, orchestrated by the shifting phases of the lunar cycle. During the quiet interval of the midnight watch, the moonlight functioned as a silent conductor for the human spirit, providing a cool and ethereal light that facilitated both navigation and contemplation within the domestic sanctuary. As the moon reached its zenith, its light filtered through the small, leaded glass windows of the bedchamber, creating intricate and geometric patterns of silver upon the rough-hewn oak floorboards and the heavy, textured wool curtains of the bedstead. This light possessed a tangible, almost physical quality, a serene and weightless presence that seemed to coat every surface in a fine layer of celestial frost, transforming the humble furniture of the 17th century home into artifacts of high relief and spectral beauty. The light reflected softly off the polished surfaces of pewter basins, the brass hinges of heavy wooden chests, and the smooth, cold stone of the hearth, creating a symphony of subtle highlights that guided the wakeful individual through the stillness. Outside the thick stone walls and the heavy timber frames, the natural world was rendered in a dreamlike and luminescent haze, where the familiar shapes of the village church, the thatched cottages, and the ancient hedgerows became silent monuments in the indigo mist. The moon was the ultimate chronological authority for the pre-industrial community, its rising and setting marking the boundaries between the first sleep, the period of wakefulness, and the final, restorative descent into the second sleep. This celestial clock was synchronized with the biological rhythms of the household, fostering a sense of profound harmony between the human experience and the movements of the heavens. In the rural districts, the moonlight illuminated the frost upon the fields or the dew upon the orchard grass, creating a vast and shimmering landscape that felt like a protective embrace rather than a threatening wilderness. This connection to the celestial light was deeply embedded in the early modern psyche, which viewed the moon as a benevolent guardian of the night's deep mysteries and a facilitator of the soul's spiritual journey. The silence that accompanied this moonlight was absolute and immersive, a quietness so deep that it allowed the internal thoughts of the midnight scholar or the rhythmic prayers of the pious to resonate with unprecedented clarity. The blue light illuminated the microscopic dust motes suspended in the cold, still air of the room, creating a visual representation of the slow, unhurried passage of time. Every texture within the bedroom, from the coarse grain of the linen sheets to the intricate carvings upon the headboard, was accentuated by the sharp and unwavering lunar shadows, providing a sensory and spatial map for the individual navigating the midnight hour. As the moon moved across the indigo vault of the sky, its changing angle signaled the progression of the watch and the approaching return of the heavy, welcome slumber of the second sleep. This was a world where the night was lived in the presence of the stars, and the moon was the ultimate source of order and peace within the darkness. Its cool blue influence encouraged a state of calm and persistent alertness, perfect for the slow integration of the day's labors and the quiet processing of the subconscious. The moonlight night ambience was a sanctuary of profound beauty, a lost dimension of sensory experience that provided a restorative and stable backdrop for the ancient practice of biphasic rest. Every shimmering reflection upon a dark pane of glass, every deep and velvet shadow beneath a heavy table, and every sliver of silver light upon a sleeping face was a part of a larger, cosmic rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the natural world. This atmospheric sanctuary was a necessary component of pre-industrial resilience, offering a sense of continuity and cosmic protection in a world defined by the absolute power of the elements. As the light shifted and the shadows lengthened, the sleeper would carry the peace of the moonlight back into their bedding, ensuring a seamless and tranquil transition into the final phase of their nocturnal journey towards the dawn. The presence of the moon was a constant, quiet reminder of the cyclical nature of existence, where the darkness of the watch was merely a bridge between two periods of deep and necessary rest. Every beam of light that touched the dark wood of the floor was a testament to the enduring bond between the celestial and the domestic, a bond that nurtured the body and the mind in the silent hours of the 17th century night. The interval of wakefulness between the first and second sleep was a period that 17th century theologians and spiritual writers considered a sacred sanctuary, a lost continent of time for the human soul to engage in its deepest communion with the divine. In a world saturated with religious thought and anxiety, the deep stillness of the midnight watch offered an unparalleled opportunity for intense self-examination, free from the clamor and distractions of the daytime household. This deliberate pause in rest was not viewed as a burden of insomnia, but as a functional necessity for spiritual growth, providing a quiet, contemplative theater for the soul to navigate its complex relationship with God. A single candle or rushlight would often be lit, casting a warm, flickering glow upon the leather covers of a cherished Bible, a prayer book, or a work of practical divinity. The air within the bedchamber during these hours was often cool and utterly motionless, carrying the subtle scents of seasoning oak, drying herbs, and perhaps the faint, earthy aroma of the banked hearth fire. The silence of the night was not a void but a presence, a heavy and palpable stillness that amplified the softest whisper of prayer. The rhythmic tick-tick of the woodworm in the antique furniture, or the slow, deep breathing of the household. For many, this was the time of the examination of conscience, a methodical review of the day's actions, thoughts, and failures conducted with a rigorous honesty that was considered essential for spiritual health. This process often involved the reading of scripture or the singing of psalms in low, measured tones that resonated within the silent walls. The visual environment, characterized by deep shadows and localized light, mirrored the internal spiritual journey, illuminating the small circle of faith within the vast darkness of the world. Contemporary journals frequently document these hours as the most productive for spiritual inventory, allowing individuals to integrate their daily experiences with their theological beliefs. The concept of the soul's night journey was a common trope, viewing the watch as a period where the soul could detach itself from the material world and prepare for the final judgment. In rural districts, a farmer might use the time to read scripture by hearth light. And in trading centers, merchants balanced ledgers, but also their spiritual accounts. The Biphasic rhythm provided a built-in infrastructure for spiritual resilience, offering a predictable and reliable descent into a quietude that nurtured both the body and the intellect. As the watch progressed, signaled by the physical cooling of the body and the creeping heavy-liddedness, the individual would carefully secure their papers or close their Bible, returning to the heavy linen sheets of their bedding, carrying the insights gained during the watch into the final, restorative phase of the nocturnal cycle. This structured approach to the night reflected a broader understanding of human nature as being fundamentally connected to the environment and the divine will. The sacred silence of the watch was not an empty void, but a restorative sanctuary, a time where the human spirit could rest and integrate itself within the slow, unhurried pulse of the natural world. Every aspect of this period, from the cool touch of the linen sheets to the faint blue mist hanging in the cold air, was a component of a universal human experience that respected the ancient requirement for a silent and restorative interval within the heart of the darkness. The management and experience of artificial illumination during the 17th century night was a critical factor in defining the parameters of the divided sleep pattern, influencing both the duration and the quality of the wakeful interval known as the watch. In an era dominated by natural cycles, the descent of true darkness necessitated a reliance on varied forms of lighting that were inherently localized, expensive, and often precarious, demanding constant attention from the wary or contemplative occupant. For the majority of the population, especially those in rural districts or humble urban quarters, the primary source of light after the sun had set was the rushlight, a simple device constructed from a common metal rush that had been peeled, dried, and dipped in tallow or common household grease. These lights provided a minimal, spluttering flame that was notoriously smoky, malodorous, and short-lived, often lasting only 15 or 20 minutes before requiring the rush to be advanced in its forged iron holder. The soft tek-tek-tek of the rush as it burned was a familiar acoustic companion during the deep midnight hours, a rhythmic reminder of the relentless progression of time in the silent household. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were a more substantial but equally troublesome alternative, emitting a rank, greasy smell and requiring frequent snuffing to remove the charred wick that would otherwise cause the flame to flicker wildly or drown in a pool of molten fat. The visual environment created by these lights was one of extreme contrast, characterized by intense, warm highlights upon immediate objects, such as the coarse texture of linen sheets or the grain of dark oak, surrounded by vast, impenetrable shadows that seemed to pulse with the movement of the air. This limited visual field encouraged a focus on interior thoughts and localized sensation, reinforcing the meditative quality of the biphasic watch. The wealthy might utilize beeswax candles, which burned with a clean, steady, and pleasant-smelling flame, but these were luxuries reserved for the elite or special religious observations. The high cost of any form of artificial light dictated that its use was disciplined and purposeful, directly influencing the activities undertaken during the interval of wakefulness. The midnight scholar would carefully allocate their supply to align with their studies, the pious to their prayers, and the domestic worker to essential tasks that could be performed within the small, golden circle of illumination. The interaction with candlelight was also a shared sensory experience. The sound of a match striking, the hiss of the flame catchings, and the unique, heavy aroma of the burning material, genießlerin derin laiklerin doliyordu. The extinction of the light marked the definitive transition, a signal for the conscious mind to release its hold on the material world and return to the restorative, enveloping darkness of the second sleep. The scent of the extinguished wick would linger in the cool night air, serving as a sensory bridge between the wakeful state and the realm of dreams. Candlelight sleep history is thus a narrative of adaptation to scarcity, a testament to a time when humanity successfully negotiated a complex relationship with the natural elements, curating moments of profound clarity and connection within the deep, silent framework of the pre-industrial night. Every flickering shadows upon the plastered wall, every drop of hardened wax upon the wooden candlestick, and every spluttering sound in the deep silence was a component of a larger, intricate rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the natural world. The arrival of the winter solstice in the 17th century imposed a dramatic and absolute expansion upon the nocturnal domain, fundamentally altering the temporal architecture of the divided sleep pattern for agrarian and urban populations alike. In an era devoid of industrial heating or widespread artificial illumination, the relentless advance of the season's deep, penetrating cold dictates a cessation of labor and a retreat into the domestic sanctuary that was both legally and biologically absolute. The sun's early retreat, often sinking below the horizon by 4 in the afternoon, meant that the pre-industrial household was plunged into a profound and immersive darkness that lasted for nearly 16 hours, directly facilitating a significantly longer duration for both the first sleep and the subsequent wakeful interval known as the watch. This seasonal expansion of rest was not viewed as an indulgence, but as a vital ecological adaptation, a necessary conservation of metabolic energy during a time of caloric scarcity and extreme environmental stress. Beneath the thick timber-framed farmhouses or the narrower stone dwellings of the towns, the winter bedroom became a fortified harbor against the elements, where every texture and every ritual was engineered for the preservation of vital warmth. The air in these chambers was often stagnant and bitterly cold, frequently causing the sleeper's breath to crystallize into fine, icy mist in the dim light of a rushlight or a banked hearth. The heavy wool bed curtains, often dyed in deep indigo or earthy reds, were drawn tightly to create a microclimate of recycled body heat, enclosing the occupants in a dark, swaddling cocoon that provided a potent psychological sense of security against the howling wind outside. Beneath these heavy layers, which included straw-filled sacques, feather mattresses, coarse linen sheets, and numerous thick coverlets, The body surrendered to a first sleep that was deeper and more restorative, anchored by the safe, enveloping heaviness of the bedding. The interval of the midnight watch during winter possessed a unique, stark tranquility. As the household emerged into a state of quiet alertness, surrounded by a silence that felt weighted by the accumulation of frost upon the thatch or snow upon the natural lanes. In these deep hours, individuals would often remain within the warmth of the bed, using the clarity of the moment for introspective prayer, the slow processing of theological texts, or hushed, intimate conversations that reinforce family bonds. Free from the exhausting demands of the winter farm, if necessity required rising, it was done with a quiet efficiency, moving through the shadowed room with a practiced familiarity, perhaps to bank the fire or tend to livestock in an attached barn. Their movements accompanied by the rhythmic creaking of the frost-stressed timbers and the distant, muffled sound of the wind. The high cost of tallow or beeswax candles during the lean months meant that lighting was used sparingly, reinforcing a visual reliance on the faint, silvery glow of the winter moon, filtering through small, leaded glass windows. This connection to the celestial cycles was deeply embedded in the early modern psyche, which viewed the long winter nights as a period of profound spiritual reckoning and internal fortification. A time when the divided rest nurtured resilience and facilitated the necessary integration of the self with the natural order. As the watch progressed, signaled by the slow cooling of the room and the arrival of an overwhelming cognitive heaviness, the sleeper would return to the deep, final slumber of the second sleep, carried by a profound sense of survival and acceptance, awaiting the eventual, slow return of the dawn. Every frost pattern on the glass, every hiss of a log in the distant hearth, and every heavy fold of the wool blanket was part of a larger, complex rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the pre-industrial winter, providing a restorative sanctuary for the human spirit within the heart of the deep, silent framework of the seasonal darkness. The awakening in the dead of night was not merely a passive state of wakeful waiting for the 17th century pre-industrial populace. For a significant portion of the working population, especially in rural communities and artisanal households, it presented a vital sanctuary of quiet time to complete tedious or low-intensity household tasks that were otherwise difficult to manage during the daylight hours dominated by intense field labor or trading. These midnight chores were defined by their solitary nature, requiring minimal movement and often very localized illumination, which helped to preserve the crucial metabolic energy needed for the eventual second sleep and the subsequent day's exertions. One of the most prevalent activities undertaken was textile production, specifically the spinning of raw wool or flax into usable thread, a task that was nearly constant in an era when most clothing and linens were produced domestically. A lone figure might sit close to the fading warmth of the banked hearth fire, the slow, rhythmic, cyclical motion of the spinning wheel providing a low, continuous humming sound that was a common backdrop to internal thoughts in the deep silence of the dwelling. The faint, metallic rasp of carding combs preparing the fibers for the wheel might also be heard. A sensory reminder of the constant preparation required for survival, mending was another incredibly frequent midnight chore, particularly the darning of heavy wool socks or the patching of canvas or leather breeches, completed with coarse linen thread and large bone or iron needles by the meager, flickering light of a sluttering rushlight. This activity required a patient, calm focus that was perfectly attuned to the biochemical tranquility and persistent alertness induced by the high prolactin levels present during this specific phase of wakefulness. It was an ideal moment for these intricate, time-consuming repairs that would otherwise consume precious daylight hours better dedicated to gardening, planting, or harvesting. The watch also provided a necessary window for practical household maintenance and security checks, a slow, methodical walk through the premises, practicing the barring of doors or the securing of internal shutters against the damp night air. Fresh logs might be carefully placed upon the fire to ensure it would not extinguish before morning, or the status of fermentation processes for ale brewing in the cool cellar might be silently inspected. In rural districts, a farmer would utilize the quiet wakefulness to slip into an attached barn or byre to check on livestock, ensuring the security of the cattle against potential predators or the comfort of a sick or gestating animal. Their movements deliberate and practiced within the familiar topography of the shadows. Domestic servants or apprentices, whose sleep patterns were frequently dictated by the needs of the larger household, might utilize these hours to finish the preparation of materials for the next day, perhaps braiding rushes for wicks, grinding grain by hand, or ensuring the cleanliness of pewter tableware for the morning meal. There was a distinct lack of urgency associated with these midnight chores, reflecting a pre-industrial understanding of time that was cyclical and task-oriented rather than the linear and efficient models that would dominate the industrial era. The localized illumination restricted one's physical and mental horizons, forcing a concentration on the immediate task and preventing the mind from racing with future anxieties. The work performed during the watch was a quiet act of domestic duty, a methodical way to maintain order and preparedness within the heart of the deepest natural silence. As the second sleep approached, signaled by the slow cooling of the room and the arrival of a distinct heavy-lightedness, the individual would carefully secure their tools, extinguish the final meager light source, and retreat back into the heavy linen sheets and swaddling wool bedding, carrying the quiet satisfaction of completed duty into the final, restorative phase of the nocturnal cycle toward the dawn. Midnight chores were thus a functional and necessary chronological bridge, connecting the first rest to the second and transforming the deep darkness into a constructive sanctuary for the pre-industrial household. The internal geography of a 17th century dwelling was etched into the sensory memory of its inhabitants through a lifetime of nocturnal navigation conducted in near total darkness. During the midnight watch, the high cost of tallow candles and the inherent danger of an unattended flame meant that many chose to move through their homes using a sophisticated system of haptic feedback and spatial awareness rather than visual cues. This practice of memory night walking was a fundamental skill of the pre-industrial era, allowing an individual to navigate the complex layout of a timber-framed farmhouse or a narrow town dwelling with a quiet, instinctive precision that appeared almost supernatural to the modern observer. Every element of the domestic environment served as a tactile landmark in the deep silence of the night. The specific, rhythmic creak of a particular oak floorboard, the temperature shift as one moved from the warmth of the hearth to the damp chill of the larder, and the rough texture of a lime-plastered wall were all significant data points in the mental map of the sleeper. As the individual emerged from the first sleep into the wakeful interval, they might find it necessary to move across the room to tend to a dying fire, adjust a window shutter against a sudden draft, or simply to fetch a draught of water from a pewter pitcher. This movement was performed with a slow, deliberate grace that avoided the jarring sounds of an accidental collision. The hand would reach out into the velvet darkness, finding the familiar, cold iron of a latch or the smooth, polished surface of a bedpost with unerring accuracy. This intimate knowledge of the home's topography was reinforced by the pervasive silence, which allowed the ears to detect the subtle changes in acoustic resonance as one moved from a narrow corridor into a wider hall. The sense of the house also acted as a guide. The smell of seasoning timber, drying herbs hung from the rafters, and the lingering, earthy aroma of the banked hearth fire providing a constant sensory anchor. For the 17th century person, the home was not a visual space but a felt one, a collection of familiar textures and sounds that provided a deep sense of security, even when the eyes were rendered useless by the absence of light. This reliance on memory over sight fostered a unique psychological connection to the physical structure of the dwelling. Viewing it as a living extension of the self rather than a mere container, the night walk was a silent, meditative journey through a world of shadows, where the boundary between the physical and the imagined was blurred by the lack of visual definitions. It was a testament to the human ability to adapt and thrive within the natural constraints of the pre-industrial world, respecting the absolute power of the darkness while maintaining a sense of mastery over the immediate environment. As the individual returned to the safety of their bedding, guided by the same instinctive memory, they carried with them a profound sense of belonging and peace. This ancient practice of navigating the dark remains a vestigial memory in the human psyche, a reminder of a time when the night was not a void to be illuminated but a landscape to be known and inhabited through the quiet power of the senses. Every tactile encounter with a cold wall, every soft footfall on a familiar plank, and every rhythmic breath in the deep silence was a component of a larger, complex rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the natural world. The memory night walk was a silent ritual of domestic trust, a way to bridge the gap between the first and second sleep with a sense of calm and unhurried purpose within the heart of the deepest darkness. One might feel the slight vibration of the house as a distant wind pressed against the timber frame, or hear the faint scratching of a mouse behind the wainscoting, sounds that became louder and more significant in the absence of sight. The feet, often bare or clad only in light woolen stockings, felt the varying degrees of smoothness in the floorboards, noting the gaps and the unevenness that told the story of centuries of wear. This was a world where every object had a place and every place had a memory. A physical and emotional geography that provided a stable foundation for the soul during the vulnerable hours of the night. The individual was never truly lost in their own home, for the walls themselves were familiar companions that whispered of history and continuity. As the second sleep approached, the final steps back to the bed were taken with the same confident, quiet ease, leaving the dark rooms to their own silent devices until the eventual arrival of the dawn. The preparation and consumption of herbal infusions during the 17th century midnight watch represented a vital element of the pre-industrial domestic economy and health management, providing a sensory and physiological bridge between the two segments of divided rest and restoration. In an era long before the widespread availability of imported Camellia sinensis or the commercialization of breakfast teas, the majority of the population across Europe and the American colonies relied upon a sophisticated and inherited knowledge of local flora to create soothing drinks that facilitated the transition back into a restorative state after the midnight awakening. These beverages were often referred to in contemporary herbals and household manuals as simple waters or decoctions and were crafted from plants gathered during the height of the summer months and carefully dried in bundles from the kitchen rafters to preserve their essential oils and medicinal potency. Herbs such as chamomile and valerian and lemon balm and lavender were highly prized for their natural sedative properties and their ability to calm the nervous system after a day of intense physical labor, while rosemary and sage were frequently utilized for their perceived ability to clear the mind and strengthen the memory during the quiet hours of reflection and study that defined the midnight watch. The process of preparing these infusions in the dead of night was a slow and deliberate ritual conducted by the dim and flickering light of a single rushlight or the glowing embers of the banked hearth fire, which continued to radiate a soft heat long after the family had retired for the first sleep. A small iron or brass kettle would be suspended over the warmth, and the water would reach a gentle simmer as the house remained in a state of absolute silence and stillness. The act of pouring the hot water over the dried leaves in a simple pewter mug or an earthenware vessel released a complex bouquet of earthy and floral scents that provided a localized sensory experience, anchoring the individual in the present moment and distancing them from the anxieties of the past or future. This ritual provided a necessary warmth in the unheated dwellings of the period, especially during the damp and chill hours of the winter watch when the internal temperature of the house could drop significantly. The physical heat of the vessel was a comfort to hands that were often callous from manual labor, and the slow and rhythmic sipping of the infusion encouraged a state of relaxation that countered any lingering restlessness. The use of this herbals was deeply integrated with the early modern understanding of the four humors, with certain plants chosen specifically to balance the cold and dry nature of the night air. For the midnight scholar, a mild infusion of mint or hyssop might provide a subtle clarity for study, while the pious might choose vervain or motherwort to calm the spirit before returning to a state of private prayer. The social dimension of night tea was equally significant, as it offered a quiet and shared moment for household members who found themselves awake simultaneously, allowing for low-tone conversations that reinforced domestic bonds. In the absence of artificial sugar, these drinks were often enjoyed plain or perhaps sweetened with a small amount of local honey or a drop of dark molasses, reflecting the agrarian and self-sufficient origins of the ingredients. The ceramic mugs and pewter tankards used were heavy and functional, possessing a weighted presence that matched the solemnity and weight of the midnight hour. As the individual consumed the warm liquid, the internal temperature of the body would subtly rise before eventually triggering the natural cooling phase required for the second sleep. This ancient practice of utilizing the natural world was a testament to the resourcefulness and ecological integration of the 17th century household, where every plant had a specific purpose and every ritual had a place within the broader architecture of the night. Every wisp of steam rising from the mug and every earthy aroma filling the cool air was a component of a larger and complex rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the pre-industrial era. The night tea history is a narrative of mindful interaction with the environment and a lost dimension of sensory experience that facilitated a deep and restorative connection with the cycle of human rest. As the final dregs were consumed and the vessel was set aside, the individual would return to the heavy linen sheets of their bedding, carrying the lingering warmth and the soothing influence of the herbs into the final phase of their nocturnal journey towards the dawn. This practice ensured that the period of wakefulness was not a source of stress, but a constructive and peaceful interval that nurtured both the physical body and the contemplative mind in the silent heart of the night. The psychological and physiological landscape of the first sleep dreams in the 17th century was a complex tapestry of biological necessity and cultural interpretation, providing a fascinating window into the pre-industrial subconscious mind as it processed the anxieties and wonders of a world defined by the absolute power of nature. During the initial phase of rest, which followed shortly after the descent of dusk, the human brain entered a period of intense activity that was frequently described in contemporary journals and medical treatises as being influenced by the rising vapors of the evening meal and the lingering humors of the day's labor. These dreams were often characterized by a specific density and vividness as the body surrendered to the heavy linen sheets and the swaddling warmth of thick wool blankets, while the external environment remained in a state of profound and immersive silence. In the 17th century imagination, the first sleep was the time when the soul was most likely to be visited by ancestral shadows or divine warnings, reflecting a society that viewed the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms as porous and ever-shifting. The visual language of these dreams was rooted in the immediate surroundings of the agrarian and artisanal life, with imagery of vast and whispering forests. The rhythmic motion of the harvest and the flickering light of the hearth merging into surreal and symbolic narratives. As the sleeper lay within the protective enclosure of the heavy bed curtains, the mind created a private theater where the slow and rhythmic creaking of the house's timber frame or the distant hoot of an owl became integrated into the unfolding dreamscape. This era of segmented rest meant that the dreams of the first sleep were not expected to last until dawn, but were instead a distinct prologue to the midnight awakening, providing a psychological buffer that allowed the individual to integrate the day's experiences before emerging into the quiet clarity of the watch. Medical practitioners of the period often suggested that the quality of these dreams was a direct reflection of the balance of the four humors, with a surplus of black bile leading to heavy and melancholic visions, while an excess of blood might produce dreams of vibrant and chaotic energy. The sensory experience of the bedroom, the scent of drying lavender, the cold night air pressing against the shutters, and the rhythmic breathing of a spouse owl served as anchors that shaped the texture of the dreaming state. Unlike the modern experience of dreaming, which is often viewed through a purely secular and psychological lens, the 17th century individual perceived their nocturnal visions as a vital form of communication with the universe, a way to navigate the moral and physical challenges of an unpredictable world. The first sleep dreams were often fragmented and episodic, mirroring the slow and deliberate pace of pre-industrial life where time was measured by the movement of the stars rather than the ticking of a clock. As the body's core temperature reached its lowest point during this initial rest, the brain's dreaming cycles became more frequent and intense, preparing the spirit for the state of persistent alertness that would define the coming interval of wakefulness. The transition from these deep and often turbulent dreams into the silent wakefulness of the watch was a gentle and natural process, a slow rising from the depths of the subconscious into the cool and still reality of the midnight chamber. This ancient pattern of dreaming and waking provided a level of emotional integration and mental resilience that is rarely achieved in the continuous sleep cycles of the modern world. The first sleep dreams were a lost dimension of the human experience, a sanctuary of symbolism and mystery that anchored the 17th century soul in the steady and predictable pulse of the natural order. Every fleeting image of a moonlit field, every whispered word from a dream visitor, and every sensation of weightless flight was a component of a larger and complex rhythm that respected the ancient requirement for a divided and meaningful rest. As the final dreams of the first sleep dissolved, and the individual opened their eyes to the velvet darkness of the room, they carried with them a sense of profound connection to the unseen world, a connection that would be further explored in the quiet and contemplative hours of the midnight watch toward the eventual return of the light. The awakening into the deep stillness of the 17th century midnight hour was not merely a transition into a solitary state of contemplation, but frequently served as the commencement of a quiet and deeply meaningful social interval within the pre-industrial household. For the majority of the population, especially those residing in close-knit rural communities or within the densely packed artisanal quarters of early modern towns, the period between the first and second sleep was a rare sanctuary of time free from the intense physical demands of daytime labor or the constant surveillance of public life. This was the hour of true communal intimacy, facilitated by the shared experience of the natural darkness and the elevated levels of the hormone prolactin, which induced a sense of profound tranquility and persistent alertness, perfect for low-toned and thoughtful conversation. Within the main living space of the farm or cottage, the family might gather around the radiant warmth of the banked hearth fire, which cast a dim, cool light and deep shifting shadows across the rough-hewn oak table and the uneven stone floorboards. A shared pewter mug of herbal tea made from chamomile or valerian might be passed silently from hand to hand, while a domestic worker continued to work at the spinning wheel, its slow cyclical hum, a gentle backdrop to the hushed voices. Topics discussed during this sacred silence range from legal matters concerning the family's land or inheritance to theological debates inspired by the previous day's sermon, or even the sharing of local folklore and ancient cautionary tales transmitted in measured tones that did not disturb the profound silence enveloping the rest of the community. The social dimension of the watch was particularly significant for married couples who utilized this undisturbed privacy to strengthen their domestic bonds far from the constant gaze of children or servants. These conversations allowed for an emotional processing and integration of the day's events, creating a level of resilience that was anchored in the predictable rhythm of the divided night. The visual environment, characterized by localized illumination and vast impenetrable shadows, fostered a unique sense of proximity where expressions were softened by the dim light and true communication occurred through the rhythm of breath and the haptic presence of another body. In some rural districts, the watch also facilitated purposeful visits between neighbors who would navigate the dark and familiar lanes with an intimate knowledge of the terrain, perhaps to exchange essential tools, check on gestating livestock, or simply to find comfort in human connection during the deepest segment of the night. There was a distinct lack of urgency associated with these midnight interactions, reflecting a pre-industrial understanding of time that was cyclical rather than the linear and efficient models that would dominate the coming industrial era. Every muffled whisper, every rhythmic sip from a warm tankard, and every creaking of a joint in a shared chair was a component of a larger and complex social rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady, predictable pulse of communal life toward the eventual return of the heavy welcome slumber of the second sleep. As the interval drew to a close signaled by the physical cooling of the body and the arrival of an overwhelming cognitive heaviness, the family or neighbors would unifiedly withdraw from the hearth to their respective beds, carrying the quiet satisfaction of human connection into the final restorative phase of the nocturnal cycle, the solitary and profoundly resonant acoustic signature that most defined the architecture of the pre-industrial urban night in the 17th century was the distant, rhythmic, and callous cry of the night watchman, a lone figure of civic authority patrolling the dark, cobbled lanes while the vast majority of the population was suspended within the mysterious interval between the first and second segment of divided sleep. The sound of his heavy, iron-shod boots striking the damp stones, often accompanied by the dry, sharp, wooden rattle used to signal emergency such as fire, traveled with remarkable and eerie clarity through the still, cold night air, penetrating the thick plaster walls and tightly closed internal wooden shutters of the sleeping quarters. His voice, roughened by decades of exposure to the damp, chill, and smoky atmosphere, would rise at regular chronological intervals, calling out the hour, the phase of the moon, and the state of the weather in a traditional, melodic chant. For the individual awake during the quiet clarity of the midnight watch, this cry was not perceived as an intrusive disturbance, but as a profound source of psychological reassurance and existential comfort. It functioned as a vital sensory anchor within the deep, silent void of the early modern night, providing a tangible connection to the ordered world of the daytime. The watchman was the temporal marker of the community, a living, breathing human clock that segmented the vast and unpredictable darkness into understandable, manageable units of time. He was the vigilant guardian against the existential dread of every crowded 17th century town, the sudden, catastrophic outbreak of fire, as well as the enforcer of security against potential miscreants, vagabonds, or night walkers who dared to move through the streets after the legal cessation of activity, hearing the faint, mournful call of past 2 o'clock and the calm morning, provided a necessary chronological map for the contemplative mind of the midnight scholar or the pious reflector, indicating precisely how much of the precious wakeful interval remained before the body's natural requirements dictates a return to the final restorative phase of the nocturnal cycle. The sound created a unique and powerful psychological safe harbor, a confirmation that civic order and divine protection were being actively maintained while the physical world lay sleeping. As the echo of the cry faded gradually into the distance, it often left the subsequent silence feeling even deeper, more immersive, and more velvet-like than before, allowing the body to relax further into the heavy linen sheets and the swaddling warmth of thick wool bedding. The watchman's presence was a constant, quiet testament to the early modern negotiation between the wild chaos of the absolute dark and the human desire for structured safety and domestic peace. His solitary figure, armed with only a simple lantern casting a meager, cool glow and the formidable billhook for defense, represented the fragile boundary of civilization during the vulnerable, silent hours. Every rhythmic call, every heavy footfall in the distant mud or stone, and every rattle of his warning device was a component of a larger and complex urban rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the pre-industrial world toward the eventual, welcome return of the second sleep. This acoustic thread connected every wakeful household in the stillness, a universal reminder of shared existence, cosmic order, and mutual vulnerability in the face of the infinite night. The interval between the first and second sleep in the 17th century provided a rare and sanctified space for profound domestic intimacy and quiet connection within the shared confines of the four-poster bed, enclosed by heavy, insulating wool curtains that created a micro-universe of absolute privacy far from the prying eyes of children or servants sleeping in the adjacent chambers or on trundle beds below. As the household emerged into the calm alertness of the midnight watch, couples found themselves united in a biological tranquility induced by the sustained release of the hormone prolactin during the preceding hours of deep rest. This unique state of persistent alertness, combined with physical relaxation, encouraged a level of hushed, low-toned communication that was seldom possible during the exhausting labor of the agrarian or artisanal day. The acoustic environment of the enclosed bed magnified the softest sounds into significant events. The gentle, rhythmic rustle of the coarse linen night shift against the skin, the almost inaudible haptic pulse of two bodies lying in close proximity, and the synchronized pattern of breathing that mirrored the slow, unhurried turning of the celestial clock. In these deep hours of the night, conversation was stripped of performative elements, becoming a quiet exchange of shared burdens, hopes, and spiritual anxieties, conducted in whispers that felt weighted with the gravity of the midnight hour. The sense of connection was primarily tactile and auditory, a comforting hand resting upon a callous shoulder, the interlocking of fingers beneath the heavy wool blankets, or simply the reassuring weight of another human presence anchoring the soul against the vast, silent void of the 17th century darkness. There was no modern urge to look at one another, as the lack of light focused attention on the nuances of tone and the physical sensation of proximity. This shared wakefulness was a vital adaptive mechanism, a structured opportunity for emotional integration and domestic bonding that nurtured resilience within the pre-industrial family unit. The atmosphere within the swaddling curtains was thick with the earthy scent of drying lavender. Beeswax candles extinguished hours ago, and the faint, metallic tang of the night mist lingering just beyond the leaded glass window shutters. Outside, the only sounds might be the distant hoot of an owl, the rhythmic creaking of the frost-stressed timber frame, or the muffled footsteps of the night watchman calling the hour 2 miles away. But inside this enclosed haven, the focus was entirely internal, on the quiet heartbeat of the relationship itself. As the watch progressed, the hushed dialogues would naturally dissolve into a final, restorative silence, a precursor to the second sleep that was as predictable and welcome as the cessation of labor at dusk. This ancient pattern of segmented rest ensured that intimacy was not a hurried prelude to unconsciousness, but a deliberate, mindful engagement with the soul of the other in the silent heart of the night. Every soft exhale, every shifting of weight upon the straw-filled mattress, and every silent prayer shared in the dim, cool light was a component of a larger and complex rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of human connection toward the eventual arrival of the dawn. The quiet night connection was a lost dimension of pre-industrial resilience, a sanctuary of shared vulnerability and strength within the deepest framework of the seasonal darkness. Every tactile encounter with a warm body, every soft footfall on a familiar plank, and every rhythmic breath in the deep silence was a component of a larger, complex rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the natural world. The final and definitive surrender to the restorative embrace of the 17th century second sleep marked the conclusion of the active interval of the midnight watch and the beginning of a profound physiological state of rest that carried the pre-industrial household safely toward the inevitable arrival of the dawn. This segment of divided slumber, which usually commenced between 2 and 3 in the morning and lasted until shortly before sunrise, was characterized by a distinct and pervasive sense of luxurious heaviness that was fundamentally different from the restorative but vital fatigue that dictated the first sleep shortly after dusk. As the individual prepared to return to their bedding, having utilized the intervening hours of wakefulness for silent reflection, prayer, study, or the quiet processing of the four humors, they would facilitate a gradual cooling of the body's core temperature, which was a necessary trigger for this second, deep phase of sleep, within the swaddling confines of the four-poster bed enclosed by heavy, textured wool curtains dyed in deep, earthen indigo or madder tones. The bedding itself had become a perfect, insulated cocoon, having absorbed and retained the collective body heat of the occupants during the preceding hours, sinking back into the deep layers of the mattress, which was often stuffed with dried straw, corn husks, or more luxurious goose feathers for the wealthy. The sleeper experienced an almost immediate sensation of absolute security and comforting warmth that contrasted sharply with the damp, penetrating chill of the unheated bedroom air. This physical comfort acted as a potent psychological sedative, dissolving any lingering anxieties concerning the harvest, the household accounts, or spiritual salvation, and allowing the subconscious mind to drift with rhythmic ease back toward the realm of dreams. Unlike the fragmented and often turbulent dreams associated with the first sleep, which were viewed by contemporary medical practitioners as influenced by dietary vapors and daytime exertions, the second sleep was viewed as a more peaceful, profound state, a vital period of deep cellular repair and metabolic conservation that was respected by the household and the community as essential for physical resilience. During these hours, the human brain prioritized different stages of sleep architecture, including a significant proportion of rapid eye movement or REM sleep, which was critical for emotional regulation and cognitive integration. This biological necessity meant that the second sleep was a period of intense subconscious activity, a quiet internal landscape where the self was strengthened and consolidated. Every tactile encounter with the familiar, heavy linen sheets, every soft haptic adjustment of weight upon the shifting straw-filled ticking, and every rhythmic inhalation in the velvet-like darkness reinforced the primal comfort of being grounded and protected within the domestic harbor. Outside the shuttered windows, the natural world lay bathed in the cool, spectral blue light of the setting moon, or enveloped in the dense, immersive darkness preceding the first light. The only external sounds might be the distant, muffled splash of a river, the slow, circular flight of a hunting owl, or the slow, rhythmic creaking of the frost-dressed timber frame. But inside this enclosed sanctuary, the focus was entirely internal, a universal entry into a state of deep, healing unconsciousness. This ancient pattern of segmented rest ensured that the second sleep was not a luxury, but a fundamental component of the 17th century experience, a reliable and necessary sanctuary that prepared the individual to rise with the arrival of the dawn, physically fortified, mentally clear, and spiritually grounded. Every soft exhale of breath, every peaceful dream image of a moonlit field, and every comforting layer of swaddling warmth in the deep silence was a component of a larger, complex rhythm that anchored the pre-industrial individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the natural order toward the eventually return of the daylight. The final, subtle transition from the deep restorative layers of the second sleep into the active consciousness of the 17th century morning was a process strictly dictated by the inexorable rise of the sun and the gradual withdrawal of the intense, all-encompassing darkness that had defined the nocturnal domain. For the early modern household, the concept of a synchronized mechanical alarm was entirely absent, replaced instead by the reliable, natural chronological markers provided by the environment itself. The perception of pre-dawn wakefulness began not with visual cues but with a heightened sensory awareness of shifting temperatures and auditory signals that penetrated the heavy textured wool bed curtains as the earth rotated toward the light. The internal temperature of the unheated bedchamber often reached its absolute minimum, causing the sleeper's breath to crystallize into fine icy mist in the dim, cool light. This increasing chill acted as a biological trigger, signaling the body to release the remaining heavy-liddedness of the second sleep and prepare for the demands of the coming day. Outside the small, lidded glass windows, which were often covered in intricate patterns of frost, the sky would begin to transition from the deep, velvet indigo of the watch into the pale, misty gray of twilight, a period known culturally as cockcrow or the breaking of the day. This crepuscular light was accompanied by a distinctive chorus of domestic and natural sounds. The first, rhythmic crowing of a cockerel, the lowing of livestock in the attached barn, or the distant, muffled rhythmic splash of a river, all serving as a universal chronological map for the community. Within the enclosed sanctuary of the four-poster bed, the individual would emerge from their final dreams, which were considered the clearest and most prophetic, experiencing a unique form of mental clarity and physical restoration, resulting from the successful segmentation of their rest. This feeling of being grounded and fortified was a prerequisite for the immediate labor required. Rising was not an act of abrupt interruption, but a gradual unfolding. A slow shedding of the swaddling warmth of the heavy linen sheets and thick coverlets, moving quickly through the shadowed room with practiced familiarity, perhaps to the main hearth to carefully relight the domestic fire from the banked embers that had glowed faintly blue and red throughout the long winter night. The air outside the bedding was often bitter and sharp, carrying the scent of seasoning oak, damp earth, and perhaps the faint, metallic tang of the morning frost. For many, this pre-dawn interval was also a final sacred moment for quiet prayer or the silent review of household affairs before the public clamor of the daylight hours commenced. The pre-dawn wake history is thus a narrative of biological harmony with the environmental clock, a lost rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the pre-industrial world toward the eventually full return of the daylight. Every tactile encounter with the cold stone floor, every rhythmic puff of crystallized breath, and every sound of the waking village in the deep silence was a component of a larger and complex rhythm that respected the ancient requirement for a divided and meaningful rest. This transition was a testament to human resilience and adaptation, a cycle of descent into woman's resilience and adaptation. The arrival of the dawn in the 17th century was not an abrupt event defined by the ringing of a clock or the artificial glare of a lamp, but a slow and majestic transition from the absolute indigo of the second sleep into the pale, misty gray of the morning. This segment of the night, often referred to as the dawn tide or the breaking of the day, served as the final threshold of the biphasic cycle. As the sun began its ascent behind the distant, wooded hills or the uneven roof lines of the town, the quality of the light changed from the sharp, silvery glow of the moon to a soft, diffuse luminosity that seemed to dissolve the edges of the furniture and the heavy, textured wool curtains of the bedstead. This early morning light possessed a cool, ethereal character, filtering through the small, leaded glass windows and illuminating the fine dust motes and the lingering night mists that had settled in the cold, unheated air of the bedchamber. For the 17th century individual, this was the moment of complete awakening, a time when the body's internal clock, synchronized for generations with the celestial movement, signaled the transition from the restorative subconscious to the active, conscious world of labor and duty. The silence of the room was gradually replaced by a burgeoning symphony of environmental sounds that acted as a natural alarm. The first rhythmic crowing of a cockerel in the farmyard, the lowing of cattle in the attached barn, and the distant muffled splash of a river, all serving as a universal chronological map for the community. Within the enclosed sanctuary of the four-poster bed, the sleeper would emerge from the final dreams of the second sleep, which were considered the clearest and most spiritually significant, experiencing a unique form of mental clarity and physical fortification, resulting from the successful segmentation of their rest. Rising was not a hurried or jarring act, but a deliberate and rhythmic unfolding. A slow shedding of the swaddling warmth of the heavy linen sheets and the numerous thick coverlets that had provided a cocoon against the night's chill. The air outside the bedding was often sharp and biting, carrying the scent of seasoning oak, damp earth, and perhaps the faint, metallic tang of the morning frost upon the thatch. The individual moved quickly through the shadowed room, their feet feeling the familiar grain of the dark oak floorboards, to the main hearth where the domestic fire would be carefully relit from the banked embers that had glowed faintly throughout the long, silent watch. This act of bringing forth light and heat was a sacred and functional ritual that officially ended the nocturnal cycle and commenced the daytime economy. The transition was also a time for a final, internal reflection, a quiet prayer or a mental review of the day's planned labors before the public clamor of the household commenced. The morning light transition history is a narrative of biological harmony with the natural clock, a testament to a time when humanity lived in perfect balance with the shifting shadows and the ancient requirement for a divided rest. Every tactile encounter with the cold stone of the hearth, every rhythmic puff of crystallized breath in the dim light, and every sound of the waking village was a component of a larger, complex rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the pre-industrial world. As the light strengthened and the gray mist began to lift from the lanes, the sleeper was fully transformed into the worker, ready to face the physical demands of the day with a spirit that had been nurtured and integrated by the silent, restorative hours of the biphasic night. This cycle of descent into the dark and rising into the light was the fundamental heartbeat of early modern existence, a rhythm that respected the boundaries of the soul and the requirements of the body in equal measure, ensuring a level of resilience and domestic peace that has become a lost dimension of the human story. Every sliver of gold appearing on the horizon was a promise of continuity, a signal that the long, divided night had once again performed its essential work of repair and restoration. The physical sensation of the transition was one of gradual expansion. As the senses moved from the internal focused world of the watch to the external expansive world of the morning, the eyes adjusted to the increasing visibility, noting the subtle colors returning to the tapestries, the wooden chests, and the pewter vessels, while the ears tracked the sounds of the hearth being stoked and the first movements of the household members. This slow and unhurried transition was a vital part of the 17th century health regimen, providing a buffer between the stillness of the night and the activity of the day. As the final shadows retreated to the corners of the room, the individual stood ready, anchored by the steady and predictable pulse of the celestial order. Every detail of the room, from the rough-hewn beams to the simple washstand, was revealed in the growing light, marking the return to the tangible world. The breaking of the fast in the 17th century household was not an abbreviated or hurried event, but a foundational domestic ritual that officially concluded the complex chronological architecture of the divided nights. As the pale, misty gray light of the dawn transition strengthened into a definitive morning glow, the members of the household unifiedly emerged from the heavy swaddling warmth of their second sleep bedding, their bodies physically fortified and their minds emotionally integrated by the successful completion of the ancient biphasic rhythm. This initial meal, known strictly as breakfast, was a functional requirement for sustaining the intense manual labor that defined pre-industrial existence, and its timing was strictly dictated by the rising sun rather than an arbitrary mechanical clock. The central locus of this morning activity was invariably the massive, stone-lined hearth where the banked embers of the midnight watch had been carefully stoked into a roaring, crackling fire that radiated the necessary warmth against the damp chill of the early modern dwelling. The aromatic signature of the 17th century morning was thick with the scent of seasoning oak, bubbling grains, and perhaps the faint, yeasty tang of small ale, sustenance for the body and comfort for the soul. The most common fare for the majority of the population, especially in rural districts, was a thick, hearty pottage or porridge, a slow-simmered mixture of oats, barley, peas, or other locally harvested grains, which had often been slowly cooking in a great iron cauldron suspended over the fire throughout the final hours of the second sleep. This pottage provided a complex carbohydrate foundation for the day's exertions, offering a predictable and reliable source of energy for artisanal families or those of moderate means in urban trading centers. Breakfast might also include coarse whole grain rye or wheat bread baked in the communal oven or the domestic hearth, paired perhaps with simple hard cheeses or salted butter. Every utensil used in this morning meal, from the heavy pewter spoons and latten tankards to the coarse earthenware bowls and dark wooden trenchers, possessed a weighted presence that anchored the family in a sense of historical continuity and stability. Small ale, a low-alcohol, fermented beverage that was often safer to consume than available water sources, was a near-universal accompaniment, providing both hydration and caloric intake. The consumption of breakfast was a communal act, conducted in a state of quiet rhythmic purpose, where the conversation, if any, remained hushed and focused on the immediate coordination of the day's planned labors, the tending of livestock, the mending of tools, or the cultivation of the fields. This shared breaking of the fast reinforced the domestic hierarchy and social stability, synchronizing the collective energy of the household with the unhurried, cyclical pulse of the pre-industrial world toward the eventually peak of the daylight hours. The 17th century breakfast was a narrative of self-sufficiency and resourcefulness, a testament to a time when humanity successfully negotiated a complex relationship with the natural elements, curating moments of profound clarity and connection within the steady, unhurried framework of the agrarian day. Every tactile encounter with the heavy pewter tankard, every rhythmic stir of the pottage over the hearth, and every sensory inhale of the earthy morning aromas was a component of a larger, intricate rhythm that respected the ancient requirements for sustenance, community, and a structured transition from the silent sanctuary of rest to the active realm of meaningful work. As the meal concluded and the trenchers were cleared, the final transition was complete. The long, divided night had performed its essential work, and the individual stood ready, physically replenished and mentally fortified, to face the physical demands of the day with a spirit that had been nurtured by the steady, predictable pulse of the celestial order. Every sliver of gold appearing on the horizon was a promise of continuity, a signal that the cycle of rest and sustenance was the fundamental heartbeat of early modern existence, ensuring a level of resilience and domestic peace that has become a lost dimension of the human story. Every detail of the morning meal, from the rough-hewn beams of the kitchen to the simple pewter vessel, was revealed in the growing light, marking the definitive return to the tangible world. The physical transition from the restorative stillness of the second sleep into the active labor of the 17th century morning was a methodical and rhythmic extension of the nocturnal cycle, which began with the careful and deliberate revival of the domestic hearth. This primary source of heat and light had been maintained in a state of smoldering dormancy throughout the long, divided night, and its return to a roaring flame was the foundational ritual of the day, as the pale, misty light of the dawn filtered through the small, leaded glass windows and illuminated the fine dust motes suspended in the cold air. The individual would approach the large stone fireplace and begin the process of clearing the gray ash to reveal the blue-tinged embers of the midnight watch. The act of introducing fresh, seasoned oak or beechwood and witnessing the first flickering yellow flames catch was a moment of profound sensory significance, providing a necessary psychological bridge between the internal world of the watch and the external world of communal duty. The air in the main living space was often sharp and biting during these early hours, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint, metallic tang of the frost that covered the thatch and the narrow village lanes. Following the revival of the fire, the next priority in the morning choreography was the securing of fresh water, a task that required navigating the cold, shadowed path to the local well or a nearby stream, while the world remained in a state of crepuscular silence. The rhythmic clank of the forged iron handle and the heavy, muffled splash of the wooden bucket into the dark, clear water were the first industrial sounds of the morning, breaking the velvet-like quietude of the surroundings and signaling the official commencement of the day's work. This water was essential for both the preparation of the morning pottage and the basic hygiene of the family, which was conducted with a quiet and functional simplicity by the dim light of the growing dawn. In their rural districts, the morning chores were inextricably linked to the welfare of the livestock, whose biological rhythms were perfectly synchronized with the rising sun. The individual would enter the attached barn or byre, their movements accompanied by the lowing of cattle and the soft, rhythmic rustling of straw beneath their feet. The task of milking and feeding was a meditative and intensive process, requiring a calm and steady hand that mirrored the unhurried pulse of the pre-industrial world. The warmth of the animals and the earthy scent of the hay provided a sensory sanctuary that contrasted with the chill of the external world. Within the kitchen, the preparation of the morning meal involved the slow simmering of grains in a great iron cauldron suspended over the newly lit fire, a process that filled the room with the earthy, comforting aroma of bubbling oats and barley. Every utensil used in these rituals, from the heavy pewter spoons and latten tankards to the coarse earthenware bowls, possessed a weighted presence that anchored the individual in the tangible reality of the 17th century morning. These early rituals were not viewed as burdens but as necessary and honorable components of a well-ordered life, providing a structured transition that allowed the mind to remain clear and focused after the insights gained during the midnight watch. The absence of mechanical clocks meant that time was measured by the completion of these specific tasks and the gradual strengthening of the sunlight upon the lime-plastered walls. The individual functioned as a vital component of the domestic machine, their labor ensuring the continuity and stability of the household through the predictable repetition of ancient habits. As the mist began to lift from the fields and the sky transitioned into a brighter gray, the morning chores reached their peak, marking the definitive end of the nocturnal cycle and the full return to the active realm of the pre-industrial day. The physical efforts required for these tasks acted as a secondary physiological stimulant, fully awakening the limbs and preparing the spirit for the complexities of the harvest or the trade. Every tactile encounter with the cold iron of a tool, every rhythmic stir of the cooking pot, and every sensory inhale of the crisp morning air was a component of a larger and complex rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the natural order toward the eventually full return of the daylight This ancient pattern of morning ritual was a testament to human resilience and adaptation, a cycle of labor and rest that had remained unchanged for generations, ensuring a level of domestic peace and social stability that has become a lost dimension of the human story. As the final shadows retreated to the corners of the room, the individual stood ready, physically replenished and mentally fortified, to face the challenges of the 17th century day with a spirit that had been nurtured and integrated by the silent, restorative hours of the biphasic night. The medical and physiological framework governing 17th century human rest was deeply anchored in the ancient humoral theory, which viewed the body as a delicate balance of four primary fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This medical doctrine, largely derived from classical authorities such as Galen and Hippocrates, dictated that the segmentation of sleep into two distinct phases was not an inconvenience but a fundamental prerequisite for maintaining optimal physical health and psychological stability. The first sleep, occurring shortly after dusk, was widely regarded by early modern medical practitioners as the period of essential digestion, a time when the brain's heat was reduced by the cooling effect of rising vapors from the stomach's concoction of the evening meal, a process known as the digestion of the concoction. This initial slumber, characterized by its profundity and restorative heaviness, was vital for allowing the internal organs to perform their catalytic functions uninterrupted by conscious activity. The subsequent waking periods, the watch or the first awakening, usually taking place around the profound silence of the deep midnight, was viewed by physicians not as a failure of the body's rest cycle, but as a functional state of heightened cognitive and spiritual clarity. During these midnight hours, the hormonal balance of the body shifted, specifically with elevated levels of prolactin, which contemporary observation associated with a state of tranquil contemplation and a specific quality of persistent alertness. This wakeful interval was deemed the optimal time for the brain to process the intellectual and sensory inputs of the previous day without the interference of new external stimuli. The early modern medical view emphasized that this interval was crucial for allowing the brain's internal humors, particularly the vital spirits and animal spirits, to regenerate and reorganize. Failure to utilize this time for prayer, quiet reading, or the slow integration of memory was thought to lead to a stagnation of the vital spirits, potentially resulting in conditions such as melancholia or a thickening of the wit. The second sleep, following the quiet activities of the watch, was then categorized as the time for deep cellular repair and metabolic consolidation. This final phase of rest was believed to be dominated by the humors of blood and phlegm, which facilitated the nutrient-rich distribution of processed concoctions to the muscles and nervous system, ensuring physical resilience against the labor of the coming dawn. A critical element of these early modern health beliefs was the strict avoidance of sleeping during the full, blinding daylight hours, which was universally condemned as harmful and unnatural, believed to cause headaches, heavy humors, and the pervasive dampening of the digestive fire. Conversely, the divided night was championed as the natural rhythm of the human form, a rhythm that balanced the cold and moist requirements of the subconscious dreaming state with the warm and dry requirements of conscious thought and action. This intricate understanding of the sleep cycle was reflected in the widely disseminated medical texts, herbals, and household health manuals of the era, which provided specific instructions on how to curate the environment of the watch, suggesting the consumption of warming, balancing herbal waters made from chamomile, valerian, or lemon balm, which were believed to aid the humorous transition between the two segments of rest. The absence of insomnia as a distinct social or medical category during this period is a powerful testament to the efficacy and universality of this health belief system. Wakefulness in the deep midnight was integrated into the expected flow of life, a functional sanctuary for the mind to breathe in the restorative embrace of the darkness. Every aspect of this approach, From the interpretation of first sleep dreams as humoral reflections to the utilization of the watch for spiritual inventory was component of a larger, intricate health narrative that respected the ancient requirement for a divided, structured, and meaningful rest in the heart of the seasonal darkness toward the inevitable arrival of the dawn. This system of belief provided 17th century individuals with a sense of agency and stability in a world where physical survival was inherently fragile, anchoring their most private moments within the predictable, unhurried, and universally recognized pulse of the natural and humoral order. The 17th century social fabric was intricately woven around the predictable and universal rhythm of the divided night, creating a collective chronological consensus that dictated everything from legal proceedings and labor contracts to the informal protocols of domestic hospitality and neighborhood security. In a world where mechanical timepieces were the rare luxuries of the urban elites, the community relied upon the biological and environmental markers of the first and second sleep to define the boundaries of the day and the specific duties of the night. The societal expectation was not one of continuous slumber, but of a structured and meaningful engagement with the darkness, a perspective that is profoundly evidenced in the extensive legal depositions and court records of the era, where witnesses frequently used the terminology of the sleep cycle to provide precise timelines for events. A witness might testify that a specific occurrence took place after the first sleep, but before the arrival of the midnight watch, indicating a chronological clarity that was understood by judges, lawyers, and commoners alike. This shared understanding created a unique social stability, where the period of the watch was viewed as a legitimate and functional window for activity rather than a sign of restlessness or medical dysfunction. The sound of the night during these hours was a complex tapestry of domestic and civic responsibility. The distant and rhythmic tolling of a parish bell signaling the arrival of the midnight hour, its deep and metallic resonance traveling through the cold, still air and penetrating the thick timber-framed walls of the cottages, or the slow and methodical scratching of a quill across parchment in a nearby town dwelling, as a local magistrate recorded his reflections in the velvet silence. Within the rural villages, the societal expectation included the shared vigilance, where the quiet wakefulness of one household provided a secondary layer of security for the next, a silent network of awareness that respected the ancient requirements for a peaceful and restorative rest. The concept of insomnia as a clinical disorder was virtually non-existent in the 17th century lexicon, because the act of being awake in the heart of the night was not perceived as a failure of the body but as a natural and sacred sanctuary for the soul. A person found walking the lanes during the watch was not necessarily viewed with suspicion if their movements were purposeful and quiet, perhaps tending to a sick neighbor or checking the security of a communal barn, their footsteps on the damp earth or cobblestones producing a soft and rhythmic fikak sound that was absorbed by the pervasive night mist. This societal consensus also dictated the architecture of the home, with bedchambers designed to facilitate the easy transition between the two segments of rest through the use of heavy curtains and the strategic placement of the hearth. The heavy and textured wool blankets and the coarse linen sheets were not just items of comfort, but components of a social contract that valued the restorative power of the divided night. To disturb another's first sleep without dire necessity was considered a significant breach of social etiquette, a violation of the primal security that the darkness was supposed to provide. Conversely, the quiet conversations and shared reflections of the watch were seen as vital for the emotional integration and resilience of the family unit, allowing for a depth of connection that the hurried pace of the daylight hours could not afford. Every aspect of this period, from the cool touch of the pewter mugs used for night tea to the rhythmic and slow breathing of the sleeping village, was a component of a larger and complex societal rhythm that anchored the 17th century individual in the steady and predictable pulse of the pre-industrial world toward the eventual return of the second sleep. This collective rhythm fostered a sense of profound harmony between the human experience and the movements of the celestial clock, ensuring that the night was a time of order and peace rather than a void of chaos or anxiety. As the watch progressed and the natural requirements for the final rest began to weigh upon the limbs, the individual would return to the swaddling warmth of their bedding with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that their wakefulness had been a productive and recognized part of the community's life. The societal expectations of the 17th century thus provided a stable and supportive framework for the biphasic habit, a lost dimension of human organization that respected the boundaries of the spirit and the requirements of the body in equal measure. Every sliver of moonlight appearing on the rough-hewn floorboards and every distant call of the night watchman was a testament to this enduring bond between the civic and the domestic, a bond that nurtured the resilience and the peace of the early modern world within the heart of the deepest darkness. The gradual and systematic erosion of the biphasic sleep pattern in the late 18th and early 19th centuries marked one of the most significant and profound transformations in human biological and social history, a shift that was fundamentally driven by the relentless advance of the Industrial Revolution and the widespread introduction of efficient, pervasive artificial illumination. Before the widespread adoption of gas lighting and eventually electricity, the human night was a vast and largely untouchable territory, defined by the absolute power of the natural elements and the cyclical rhythms of the sun and moon. However, as the nascent industrial economy began to demand a more standardized and continuous form of labor, the ancient requirement for a divided rest began to be perceived not as a natural necessity but as an inefficient relic of a pre-modern world. The central locus of this transformation was the urban environment, where the traditional boundaries between the daytime economy and the nocturnal sanctuary were increasingly blurred by the arrival of street lighting and the centralization of factory production. These advancements effectively pushed back the boundaries of the night, allowing for a significant extension of the waking day and the systematic compression of the two segments of rest into a single, uninterrupted block of slumber known as monophasic sleep. This transition was not merely a matter of convenience but a radical restructuring of the human relationship with time itself, replacing the unhurried, task-oriented pulse of the agrarian world with the linear and rigid requirements of the mechanical clock. As the city streets became safer and more illuminated, the midnight watch, that sacred interval of quiet reflection, prayer, and domestic intimacy, began to vanish from the collective experience. The social consensus that had once respected the silence of the deep midnight was replaced by a new, industrial discipline that valued productivity and continuous wakefulness above the restorative power of the divided rest. Medical and cultural perceptions of sleep also underwent a dramatic shift during this era, with the natural awakening in the heart of the night increasingly categorized as a medical dysfunction rather than a functional state of clarity. The concept of insomnia emerged as a significant social and clinical anxiety, as individuals struggled to adapt their ancient biological clocks to the demands of the modern schedule. The physical environment of the bedroom also reflected this decline, as the heavy, textured wool curtains and the protective enclosures of the four-poster bed were gradually replaced by more open and functional designs that mirrored the increasing emphasis on efficiency and ventilation. Within these modernizing spaces, the air lost its cool, still character, becoming saturated with the noise and vibrations of the growing industrial machine. The sensory signature of the night changed from the earthy scents of seasoning oak and drying herbs to the metallic and chemical aromas of coal smoke and gas. For the working population, the loss of the biphasic rhythm meant the loss of a vital psychological buffer, a lost continent of time that had provided a necessary sanctuary for emotional integration and spiritual resilience. Every aspect of this decline, from the implementation of the 10-hour workday to the widespread installation of gas lamps in the public squares, was a component of a larger and complex narrative of alienation from the natural world. This transformation occurred at different rates across the globe, with rural communities maintaining the ancient pattern long after the urban centers had fully converted to the monophasic model. Yet by the dawn of the 20th century, the memory of the divided rest had largely faded into the realm of folklore and historical curiosity. Every flickering gaslight in a cobbled lane, every rhythmic strike of a factory bell, and every heavy, interrupted breath in a crowded urban tenement was a testament to this profound shift away from the steady and predictable pulse of the pre-industrial night toward the hurried and fragmented pace of the modern era. The decline of biphasic sleep was thus a narrative of adaptation to a new, artificial environment. A story of how humanity successfully yet tragically negotiated a divorce from its ancient biological heritage, curating a world where the darkness was no longer a space to be inhabited with dignity and grace, but a void to be conquered and filled with the relentless clamor of progress. Every detail of the changing sleep architecture, from the thinning of the bed linen to the removal of the domestic hearth, marked the end of an era when the night was lived in harmony with the soul and the requirements of the body in equal measure, ensuring a level of disconnection that has become a defining characteristic of the modern human condition. As the individuals of the 19th century were increasingly pulled into the orbit of the machine, the quietude of the midnight watch was sacrificed on the altar of utility. The very air of the night seemed to change, growing heavy with the soot of coal and the persistent hum of distant steam engines. The internal landscape of the mind, once nurtured by the slow and rhythmic processing of the divided rest, became increasingly cluttered and anxious as the expectation of a single 8-hour block of unconsciousness created a new form of temporal pressure. The transition was also visible in the shifting medical literature, where authors began to warn against the dangers of broken sleep, pathologizing a rhythm that had served the human species for millennia. This cultural amnesia was reinforced by the architectural shifts in housing, as the massive stone-lined hearths were replaced by efficient iron stoves, and the shared communal spaces of the farmhouse gave way to the isolated, partitioned rooms of the urban apartment. Every sliver of artificial light that penetrated the evening shadows was a nail in the coffin of the biphasic tradition, a tradition that had once provided a profound sense of continuity and cosmic belonging. As the final shadows of the biphasic tradition retreated, the sleeper was left to navigate the long night alone, anchored no longer by the celestial clock, but by the cold and unwavering face of the mechanical watch, marking the definitive arrival of the modern age of rest, where the silence of the night was no longer a companion but a challenge to be overcome. The legacy of this decline remains embedded in our modern struggles with rest. A phantom limb of a sleep cycle that once defined the very essence of human existence in the heart of the silent, seasonal darkness, the arrival of efficient, pervasive, and accessible artificial illumination in the late 18th and early 19th centuries represented the technological and cultural pivot point that fundamentally dismantled the biphasic sleep pattern and reshaped human civilization's relationship with the natural world. Before this era, the human night was dominated by the absolute enveloping power of the seasonal darkness, an impenetrable void populated only by the shifting phases of the lunar cycle and the meager, localized, and expensive glow of tallow candles, rushlights, and banked hearth fires. This environment of extreme visual contrast inherently supported the divided night, reinforcing the transition into the first sleep shortly after dusk and facilitating the subsequent emergence into the quiet clarity of the midnight watch. However, the development and widespread adoption of gas lighting and eventually electricity acted as a seismic force of chronological colonization, effectively pushing back the sacred boundaries of dusk and dissolving the ancient temporal architecture of human rest. The centralized production of coal gas and its distribution through complex networks of urban piping in the early 19th century allowed municipalities to illuminate streetscapes, marketplaces, and artisanal workshops with an aggressive, unwavering brilliance that had never before been experienced. This innovation did not merely improve visibility but radically expanded the active hours of the day, facilitating the standardization of labor and the relentless pursuit of industrial productivity far into the traditional hours of divided slumber. The sensory signature of the night changed irrevocably. From the comforting aroma of seasoning oak and drying lavender to the sharp, metallic, and pungent scent of burning coal gas that saturated the cool night air of rapidly industrializing towns, the subsequent arrival of Thomas Edison's incandescent electric lamp later in the century solidified this transformation. Colonizing the internal spaces of the home with a sterile, dependable light that banished the intimate shadows of the four-poster bed and the contemplative quietude of the midnight watch. This constant illumination suppressed the biological production of melatonin, fundamentally altering the ancient hormonal balance that had synchronized human rest with the movements of the celestial clock for millennia. The artificial light revolution thus represents a narrative of profound alienation from the cyclical rhythms of the natural order, where the unhurried, task-oriented pulse of pre-industrial life was replaced by the rigid and unrelenting synchronization of the machine. Every flickering gas lamp in a cobbled lane, every rhythmic glow of an electric bulb in a factory window, and every interrupted breath in a crowded urban dwelling was a testament to this profound shift toward the monophasic sleep model. The divided night, with its sacred intervals of prayer, study, and domestic intimacy, was increasingly perceived not as a natural necessity, but as an inefficient relic of a less productive age. This cultural amnesia was reinforced by a new, medicalizing perspective that began to pathologize the natural awakening in the deep midnight, recategorizing a once universal state of clarity as the medical disorder of insomnia, as humanity successfully yet tragically negotiated this divorce from its ancient biological heritage, curating a world where the darkness was no longer a space to be inhabited with dignity and grace, but a void to be conquered and filled with the relentless clamor of progress, ensuring a profound disconnection from our ancestral pulse in the heart of the once silent seasonal darkness. The fundamental restructuring of the human day, initiated by the rapid expansion of the factory system during the Industrial Revolution, imposed a rigid and unrelenting chronological discipline upon the working population that directly conflicted with the ancient and restorative requirements of the biphasic sleep pattern. In the pre-industrial livre era, labor had been primarily dictated by the seasonal cycle and the availability of natural light, allowing for a fluid and unhurried transition between periods of exertion and the sacred interval of the midnight watch. However, the centralized nature of industrial production required a synchronized and continuous application of human effort to maximize the efficiency of the newly developed steam-powered machinery. This resulted in the implementation of grueling 12 to 14-hour workdays, which effectively eliminated the biological and social sanctuary of the divided night. The sensory environment of the laborer changed from the quiet, rhythmic pulse of the farm to the deafening mechanical clamor of the textile mill, where the passage of time was no longer measured by the movement of the stars but by the cold, unwavering face of the factory clock. The requirement to report for duty at a specific hour, often well before the natural arrival of dawn, necessitated an abrupt and jarring interruption of the second sleep, causing a state of chronic sleep deprivation that had profound implications for the health of the urban proletariat. The swaddling warmth of the heavy wool blankets and the protective enclosure of the four-poster bed were replaced by the stark and crowded conditions of the industrial tenements, where the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, dampness, and the pervasive, metallic tang of machinery oil. The transition to a monophasic sleep model was not a natural evolution, but a forced adaptation to the requirements of capital, where the restorative power of the midnight watch was sacrificed on the altar of utility. The systemic compression of rest into a single, often interrupted block of slumber fundamentally altered the human psyche, fostering an environment of persistent anxiety and physical vulnerability that mirrored the precarious nature of industrial life. The loss of the watch also meant the loss of a vital window for domestic intimacy, spiritual reflection, and the slow, meditative processing of the day's experiences. As the factory bell replaced the night watchman's cry as the primary chronological authority, the individual became an extension of the machine, their biological rhythms subordinated to the unrelenting pace of the assembly line. The sensory signature of the night was colonized by the flickering artificial glare of the early gas lamps and the rhythmic vibrations of distant engines, which further disrupted the production of melatonin and prevented the deep restorative descent into the second sleep. The industrial work schedule thus acted as a powerful agent of cultural amnesia, systematically erasing the memory of the divided rest and replacing it with the modern struggle for continuous unconsciousness within the heart of the once silent seasonal darkness. The emergence of the clinical and psychological concept of insomnia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was not the discovery of a new biological ailment, but the radical pathologization of a naturally occurring state of nocturnal wakefulness that had defined the human experience for countless generations. As the industrial world solidified its grip on the human schedule and the artificial light of gas and electricity colonized the traditional hours of the midnight watch, the ancient and restorative practice of divided rest was systematically erased from the collective cultural memory. In this new, rigid chronological framework, the individual who found themselves wide awake in the deep stillness of the night no longer perceived their state as a sacred sanctuary for prayer, study, or quiet reflection, but as a frustrating and alarming failure to achieve the newly mandated 8-hour block of continuous unconsciousness. This shift in perception transformed the natural and tranquil interval of the watch into a site of intense anxiety and physiological stress, as the brain, still synchronized with its ancestral biological clock, attempted to engage in its routine processing and spiritual inventory, while the conscious mind, pressured by the impending demands of the factory or office clock, fought to suppress these very activities in favor of a forced and elusive slumber. The medical profession of the Victorian era began to categorize this persistent wakefulness as a symptom of nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia, suggesting that the inability to maintain a single monophasic sleep cycle was a sign of a weakened constitution and the failure of personal discipline. This professionalization of sleep hygiene further alienated the individual from their own physical requirements, replacing the intuitive and unhurried rhythm of the pre-industrial night with a set of standardized and often contradictory rules for rest. The sensory experience of the nocturnal hours also changed, from the comforting, earthy scents of seasoning oak and drying lavender to the clinical and sterile environment of the modern bedroom, where the silence was often perceived as a void to be managed rather than a companion to be inhabited. The heavy, textured wool curtains and the swaddling warmth of the four-poster bed, which had once provided a microclimate of absolute security, were replaced by the open and often drafty spaces of the urban apartments, where the distant rhythmic clatter of street traffic and the humming of electric wires provided a constant acoustic reminder of the world's unrelenting pace. For the modern individual, the midnight awakening became a period of lonely and agonizing rumination, where the absence of the traditional social and spiritual infrastructure of the watch left the mind vulnerable to the pressures of the coming day. The loss of the biphasic habit meant that the natural cooling of the body's core temperature during the midnight hours, which had once triggered the transition between the two segments of rest, was now viewed with suspicion and dread, as a signal of a night ruined and the body failing to conform to the requirements of the machine. This era of chronological colonization represents a profound and tragic divorce from the natural order, where the unhurried, task-oriented pulse of the agrarian past was permanently silenced by the linear and rigid synchronization of the industrial age. Every tactile encounter with the cold sheets, every rhythmic tick of the bedside clock, and every heavy, frustrated breath in the velvet darkness was a testament to this profound shift away from the steady and predictable pulse of the ancestral night. The birth of modern insomnia is thus a narrative of adaptation to an artificial environment, a story of how humanity successfully yet tragically negotiated a divorce from its biological heritage, curating a world where the darkness was no longer a space to be lived with dignity and grace, but a problem to be solved and a void to be filled with the restless search for the perfect, uninterrupted rest, the final consolidation of the monophasic sleep model in the 20th century, reinforced by the relentless expansion of globalized, always-on capitalism and pervasive digital technology, has created the conditions for a multifaceted modern sleep crisis. We are now trapped in a profound biological mismatch, where our ancestral biological clock, optimized over millennia for tranquility and divided rest, clashes violently with the demands of constant technological connectivity, blue light saturation from screens, and the pervasive perception of sleep as a commodity or a waste of productive time rather than a natural sanctuary. The lingering legacy of the biphasic past manifests today as the common, frustrating phenomenon of the 3 a.m. wake-up. Instead of recognizing this interval as a natural watch, a time for spiritual reflection, quiet domestic duty, or intimate connection, the modern individual pathologizes it as medical insomnia, generating intense anxiety that makes the restorative descent into a final rest impossible. Every tactile encounter with a smooth, cold smartphone, every rhythmic, digital pulse of light in the profound darkness, and every heavy, frustrated breath in the sterile night is a testament to this tragic rupture from the steady, predictable pulse of the natural order toward the inevitable return of the dawn.